While everyone's still coming in and getting settled, I'll give you a quick introduction. Wanted to welcome everyone again to HR Trends with Friends. My name is Tom Nichols. I am the founder of Castle HR, and I am hosting this webinar with the amazing Glenn Donaldson, who is the President of Americas at IntelliHR. Today, we're extremely pleased to have Patrick Brooker and his big brain back from the CFO Centre to continue our conversation about employee turnover. But a few housekeeping items to cover off the top. As you saw in the invites, this webinar is structured uniquely. We have a lightning round approach aimed to deliver as much tactical advice from top grade professionals in about 30 minutes or less. The webinar is jam-packed, so we won't have a Q&A portion. But if you do have questions, we will be providing our contact info at the end, or you can pop a quick question into the chat box and we will get back to you on that. Lastly, if the phone rings, a kid screams, a dog barks, don't worry if you miss some of the content. We have you covered. We will be sending everyone a link of the recording in a follow-up email. And it's also hosted on some of our sites. So that's all the housekeeping. So let's get to it. I'll turn it over to Patrick first to give us a quick recap and set the stage for the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Tom. So just a brief recap from what we covered in part one using the IntelliHR turnover cost calculator. We got familiar with the key inputs, specifically your current attrition rate, which is really your total leave divided by the average number of employees in any given period. Typically, it's a year. We use your payroll data, which is the key source for all the information going into the model, specifically the wage data. We isolated the tangible, quantifiable costs, like all your invoice costs for recruiting fees, testing, or essentially all external costs. There's specific fields for that. We also focused on the hidden costs, which can be unique to your organization or in some cases specific to a class of employee. So for example, the cost will be different for a salesperson, an executive, for example, much higher cost, or in the case of a plant or transportation, operators, so specialized training for heavy equipment operators and the like, or in the case of couriers, which is the background I come from, where if you hire a new courier, typically what happens, they run tandem for a period of time until the new courier gets familiar with that particular route. So just think of the cost associated with that. Then we also have the whole aspect of how do you calculate morale costs, escalating turnover. So if somebody leaves and they're popular, what does that do? Does it lead to further turnover rates within the organization? In the case of sales, missed targets. Do I have to readjust my business forecast? Customer service. So you're focusing in on all your client-facing people. Think about all the other people's time that are affected, interviewing, asking questions, and all this other stuff. So it's not a very simple task to get it, but the tool provides an easy mechanism to get at. So while the input fields are identified covering major buckets, I encourage you to feel free to use any one of the fields to cover costs that may not be specifically identified, but are unique to your specific business. Think about with what we've been going through the last several months with COVID-19. There are new protocols that have been put in place. Those should be incorporated into your training process. The model is strategically broken down into 4 distinct categories, excluding base information and the end calculated result. They are the cost of hiring, onboarding and induction, training, learning and development, and the opportunity cost. So you can focus on these key areas to capture your cost. Depending on the size of your company, you can use the tool on a departmental level to drive down accountability and specific ownership throughout your organization. So if you're a large factory with multiple departments, you can use the tool and isolate it down to a particular department. So you can narrow down where your attrition rate is a problem for you. All of these factors combined contribute to the final result, which is your cost of turnover for a single employee and, more importantly, your annual cost of turnover based on your current attrition rate. You have to stand back and ask yourself if the results are acceptable to your particular company. Typically, it costs on average 40%, repeated, of an employee's salary. So a $100,000 employee leaving can cost you up to $40,000 to replace. Can you invest that $40,000 more effectively? Looking through the lens of a CFO, which is what I am, and a member of the leadership team, having access to quality data like this model will drive very specific questions. For example, is the turnover voluntary or involuntary? If it's voluntary, by nature, it's a surprise. I don't know about you, but if I get a surprise in an organization, there's usually shock, panic. What do I do? There's a lot of cost associated with that. What if somebody that's leaving was leading a major sales initiative, or you're in the middle of a fairly big, large project? What impact will that have on the business? What is the impact to our customers and our brand, reputation in the market? So you're looking at your client-facing people. So what are the underlying reasons? Is there a pattern? One particular person, is it their tone, the way they're approaching people? What is the average tenure of turnover? If it's less than 1 year, just think about it. I've hired them within the last year. I've invested all this money into training them and they've left. That's not a very good return on investment for me. If it's greater than a year, think about the depth that you've lost in your business, in your organization. Can you afford to do that? Can we stand back and invest in programs and strategies up front using savings from turnover as a return on investment? Do we have an HR scorecard giving us a true pulse on employee engagement? So over the next 25 minutes or so, Tom and Glenn and myself are going to discuss some strategies and tools to address this. So Tom, what are some of the strategies and tools used to reduce and manage turnover costs?
Yeah, it's a great question and something we deal with all the time. And when we're sort of there's a number of different tools in the HR toolbox when it comes to employee turnover. And what I'm going to share is two main thoughts. One is a holistic thought designed to improve turnover rate, and the other is a more tactical strategy specific for reducing your turnover cost. So the holistic strategy to help turnover reduction is simply company culture, which is sometimes an overused term and sometimes falls on deaf ears. But at the end of the day, culture is the biggest influence that we have on retention. An example of that is, did you know that 1 out of 3 people would pass on their dream job, like the job that they are working their careers to get, maybe been thinking about since they were a little kid or when they started their career? 1 out of 3 people will pass on their dream job if culture isn't a fit. So it's a huge statement on what culture can actually do. And what we actually need to do when we're talking about culture is think about why employees stay through that lens of culture. The number one reason people stay at companies is because they're happy. And you can see that evidence in your team. You know, are they coming to work happy? You can think about when you were happy going to a job, like you would show up early, you have no problem staying late, you'll help other people out, you're going to return emails outside of business hours. These are key indicators, and you know your productivity and your output is a lot higher at that point, which leads you to being happier, which leads you to staying longer. The second one is when you survey teams and ask them, you know, what was the best thing about your best leader that you ever had? The number one answer is always that they showed that they cared for you. So you have to think about, you know, does your team think that you care about them? Are you showing that in different ways? Which leads to sort of point number 3, which is recognition as well. You know, how does your team feel about the rewards and highlights given out by leadership? You know, that extra time that they're putting in, if they're happy and coming in early, staying late, if that's not recognized and they don't feel appreciated, that can quickly turn into they feel that they're being taken advantage of. And that's when we see that exit happen. So that's where we can sort of have that conversation around culture influencing. The last one is going to be the total compensation when you're thinking about everything that an employee gets from a role. So we're talking more than a paycheck or benefits. Vacation is one of those ones that sort of walks the line because vacation can be a big part of it. Like I know when you're starting off in, you know, big companies, sometimes the first 2 years straight out of university, it's kind of frowned upon if you take vacation. And that's not a very positive influence. So people tend not to stay long in those roles. They're a little bit of a meat grinder. I mean, we can also talk about compensation being mentoring, professional development opportunities. Working from home was a big thing before everybody was working from home. Team events, you know, other things that are compiled there. That's how people and employees glean, happiness and enjoyment and are going to stay longer looking through culture. So now that we've established how creating culture can influence retention, let's talk about how to make a strong culture. And every culture is different and unique. And when I think about creating culture, I like to think about, making pasta sauce. And I always think about, I worked in a restaurant growing up in my teens to be able to buy my first car and pay for school. And I always remembered learning when the chef would go out to the truck to get the produce. And he wouldn't just grab the first one. He'd actually pick through and grab the best ingredients that he could find at that point, because he knew to make the best sauce. And if we're talking about sauce, we're talking about the culture. He knew he had to have the best ingredients. And when we're talking about ingredients, we're talking about values on that side. So the beliefs, the philosophies and principles that drive your business decisions and act as that cultural cornerstone, those are the ingredients that are going to make a solid culture. Then it's going to come down to not just having great ingredients, because you throw them all in the pan and it's not going to turn out great. You have to have a proper recipe. So what is this strategy? Like, how do you empower and measure your team's ability to make decisions with the company's values in mind? So that's how you put it all together. So it's using those values to help influence your culture. And it's really because culture comes from the actions of your people at the end of the day. It's not what your values are, what's written on the wall or in a nice little handout. It's actually what your people do. That's where your culture comes from. So when we're talking about those strategies or that recipe to make it, you want to talk about showing leadership's decisions are a great starting point. Like, are they demonstrating the values that you have out there? Are they using that as a touchstone to make their decisions in the business? So if we're talking about like integrity is one of your values, and then they go off and do a shady deal, that's not reinforcing and demonstrating a solid value for you. And that's not going to make a good sauce. Talking about like an employee handbook, especially for new hires, that's what gets people up to speed and tells them this is what it's like to work here. Here's our playbook. That's going to demonstrate and influence the behavior of your team. Performance reviews, measure and evaluate values, have a mechanism in there to make sure that people are living up to those values. Values should be so strongly ingrained in your company that it should be a strike against them in a performance review, possibly a firing offense if they're not living up to a value. So you want to reinforce that, because at the end of the day, and I know Patrick loves this, like, you need to know what you're going to measure, otherwise nothing happens. Last on that side for values influencing the behavior is recruiting. If you know what values you're looking for, you know the traits that are going to be successful that you want in your company, that's going to mean that you're going to hire for those traits and focus on that, which leads to also an influence on how long they stay on that side. So that's really how you do it. If you're doing those things, you're going to influence culture. That's how your team really behaves at the end of the day when they're left to make decisions without you around, which is going to increase your retention. Now, it doesn't mean everyone's going to buy into your culture as a caveat. It means that people are going to stay that buy into your culture. And that's what you want to build for the long term as well. So that's really the first holistic strategy, talking about culture and how we look at it at Castle. For a more tactical and sort of zoomed in strategy, we're going to talk about measuring ramp up time for new hires. And why do we talk about ramp up time? Well, because that's going to reduce your turnover costs, because no matter what, your turnover rate should never be 0%. So there's always going to be a turnover. There's always going to be new hires. So this is always going to be part of that equation. But if you look at it sort of in the sense of new hires are always a cost center from day one. And it should be the organization's focus to get them to a positive ROI or contributing positive output as soon as possible. And a reduced ramp up time will allow you to get there. I always joke with sort of tech companies that I kind of see a couple similar strategies if people haven't figured this out yet, where it falls into the bucket of, here's a t-shirt and a high five, and now go get contributing and start working. And sometimes I see what I call the hot potato, which is people are going to come in and be like, oh, I forgot you were starting today. Hold on, Patrick. Glenn, can you take care of Patrick for a couple hours? I have a meeting. And it's a whirlwind at that point. So it's not motivating. It's not organized. It doesn't give that initial experience to the new hire that you want. So in contradiction to those strategies, you want to have a clear structure mapped out, and it should start before day one. where you can set out that t-shirt. I'm a big fan of the swag bag, so don't take it that way. You can send that out. You can send out the employee handbook in advance. Maybe there's some training. Maybe they come in for a shadow day before, but you really want to have that focus, once they're there and landed day one, on how they're going to get up to speed. And it's a shared responsibility between you and that new hire. So it's not just on the company, you need them buying into it as well. But what you can do to sort of expedite that process is have some key items on that strategy. So simple things like have their desk and equipment set up. You want to walk into a new office where here's your computer, here's your desk. You want IT to have already logged them into their systems and have everything organized there. You want to have a great company orientation conversation, introduce them to leadership or people they haven't met, maybe department heads or business unit leaders. You want to then introduce them to the team. So really walk them around on that side, walk through the employee handbook, ask them if they have any questions, again, reinforcing those values from day one, talk to them about that, talk to them about the culture, what it's kind of like, when do people take lunches, what are the expectations on that side. So walk through all that initially. Then you want to get into role-specific training. So like Patrick was talking about, you're going to have specific training that you need to know about, whether it's, job shadowing and going in a truck, or whether it's understanding, how your different systems work, whether it's a new CRM that you haven't worked before, maybe it's your proprietary internal system. Just have that all clearly laid out so they understand it. They know when they need to be up to speed. Now I can go on and on about these, from job shadowing to, mock projects to milestones at that point, but you really want to have that goal of where you want them to be in 30, 60, 90 days, especially when that's lining up with their probation. So understand where they should be. They should know that, you should know that, and then it's an easy conversation to follow along at that point. And the experience is also a great proactive way to increase engagement and culture, which goes back to that of retention as well, because you really get them to buy in at the beginning. So to quickly recap on my 2 points, a holistic focus on culture will help influence your turnover rate and positively affect aspects of your company. And if you don't have a clear onboarding strategy for new hires, this is a cost center that can be reduced and also influence your overall turnover rate on that side. So before jumping too much in, or any further into that, I want to hand it over to Glenn to actually talk about some of the data points that we should consider when we're looking at the attrition rate.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Patrick, as well. I think that's really key, and I really liked what you were touching on before, Tom, around the data, the onboarding, because the onboarding experience and the data that we can see as someone onboards is really key, particularly from a performance. Time to performance is really key there. How long does it take for someone to actually be performing in their role? And if you're actually turning that person over in between that period, you've essentially had no output from that employee. So understanding what that unique time to perform is in your business, because it's different for everyone and also every different role. Hopefully you guys can see my screen here. I thought what I would do is I'd screen share and just show a little bit of an attrition dashboard. So kind of just branching off the question that Tom just asked around what data should we be considering in attrition. Obviously in part one, we explored the costs around attrition. What I want to do is I want to start diving into what data actually makes up your attrition and why you should actually be focused on it. So just a real quick overview as to what you're looking at here. Basically, it's just an attrition dashboard. There's a lot of HRIS products out there that do this sort of attrition analysis. But what you really want to be looking at is diving into the actual demographic data and also essentially the data that's telling you stories and helping you understand patterns. And I think that's really key. So even for this example, let's just use a 200 headcount. Personally, we're a 50 headcount organization. I live and breathe in this dashboard, just constantly trying to understand why we're turning over people, if we're turning over people, what some of those motivators are, is really key for any organization. But 15.46% is this organization's attrition rate. Over the past 12 months, they've had 32 people leave out of a 207 headcount. But what you're starting to look at is, if we break that down by month, we can actually start to see patterns in the attrition data. So here, for instance, there's a really big increase of attrition across September, October, November. Is that unique to the business? Have they seen that before? Do we go back in time and start looking at, is that an ongoing pattern that we're seeing? We're seeing low turnover rates in the middle of the year towards April, May, June. But what you really then can start to do, and what I encourage a lot of businesses to do when they have this sort of data, is look at things like tenure. So attrition rates across tenure. 50% of our attrition turnover is occurring within the first 12 months. So just tying that back to what Tom was talking about from an onboarding perspective, that's really key as an organization. If they're if all of their turnover if 50% of that is happening in the first 12 months, that means that from an onboarding curve perspective and time to perform, they're not getting that value out of the employees. And so when we relate that 50% turnover back to that 15%, you start to see, okay, well, that's roughly 16 employees there that we didn't actually get a performance output of. But then obviously another area that you can kind of break that down into is demographic data. So I think demographic data is really important, because this is where it starts to tell stories. And I think again, an attrition rate of 15% is an attrition rate of 15%. But when you can start to localize that and understand why that's occurring, so things like turnover type, what actually was the reason for people turning over? Was it voluntary, involuntary is usually the best place to start. But then it's looking at things like, was it retirement? Was it role abandonment? Was it actual redundancy? These are sort of the patterns that we see emerging out of the data, and particularly through, I don't want to talk too much about this because I know everyone has, but COVID-19 obviously saw a very big, dramatic change of why a lot of turnover occurred in businesses, with obviously a lot of redundancies. But even things like location, so just honing in on particular locations and so on, under particular supervisors. One of the really cool things that I like to also do is relate attrition data back to recruitment sources. So where did we actually recruit that person from? Because obviously there is a large amount of money associated with recruitment, as Patrick mentioned before. So if we're spending a lot of money recruiting people from particular sources, is that actually achieving a commitment to the business and a performance output? And then also things like employee motivators or manager motivators for attrition. And you can collect that data through various means, whether it's surveys and so on. But again, one of the really key things I think when you're looking at your attrition data is insights that it can generate. So for instance, when you have this sort of data, you want to start overlaying it with each other. You want to start going, okay, well, what are the patterns in there? Well, approximately 3 of our leavers have been in this particular work class, or they've had this particular tenure. You want to start looking at things like, is there an increase in a particular gender, for instance? In this area, we've had 33% in gender other that has increased in the business. So all of these things are creating stories for you. And then it's that humane approach in actually understanding and diagnosing your data, which is when you can then take it to the next level. And then obviously, collecting this data is usually the biggest challenge, right? But that's where, again, there's a lot of HR products out there that can help with this. But what I would recommend is getting started is just getting that core data around your people and your people's jobs, so you understand your demographics, and then it's overlaying that from an attrition perspective. But Patrick, in terms of collecting the data and seeing this sort of type of way that businesses do this, what about when businesses have single attrition rates? So my example was obviously 200 headcount, 15% attrition. What about that single digit attrition rate? What do you see?
That could be a very scary position to be in. A lot of people on the call may look at that as being a good thing. And I'm skeptical. That's by nature. Because if you got a low attrition rate, so you haven't got that turnover, having that churn. And I think Tom mentioned in his, sometimes having turnover can be very healthy for a business. So when I think of a very low single digit rate, what comes to mind is complacency. Complacency can lead, certainly can lead to low attrition, because there isn't really any motivation for me to want to move out of the company. I'm being paid well. No one's bothering me. So what I really want to zero in on is what's the happy medium here. So I'm going to look at measurements from an HR perspective, and then I also want to align those measurements to my business. So am I meeting my business objectives? How many people have made a call centers probably over the last several months, and you get this attitude of somebody on the other end that says, I really don't care. We've all come across that. That's complacency. So I think what we need to zero in on is measuring the right things, as Glenn has talked about, and then we can say, are they fitting in right with our mix in our business? So when I look at it, I want to make sure that we're hiring the right people. Have we got the right bums in a seat right now? Remove those who do not fit what's happening. So in other words, have I got specific objectives set up? Am I giving them a real cause for wanting to come to work during the day? Stay competitive. There's not a lot of very unique unicorn type businesses out there today. There's a lot of competitiveness. And if you don't have your act together, you are going to lose your competitive edge. You're going to lose the revenue, and you're going to get bought out. That's what's going to happen. Instill success as a culture. So to use Tom's vernacular, it's that magic sauce. So have that. Focus on engagement. Have that happen. Then always think about benchmarking. Right? So where are we? Are we paying maybe not the top end of the grid for wages, but we're competitive. We may be better on the benefits side or the softer cost. And then again, one of the things for me is about communication. Can we do surveys and make sure we're staying on top of things? So we've got that level of engagement. So single digits may be good, may not be good. It depends on your business. You've got to have everything working like the parts of a car. It's going to go down the highway if everything's ticking along fine. So measure HR, your operational objectives, and line those with your business objectives. All those come into play.
Yeah, definitely. And I like that that point you made around benchmarking, because for particularly for myself in our business, internal benchmarking I think is really key. So the data that I showed, we actually service that up for our leaders to look at, and a lot of organizations that I work with do have the attrition data available for their leaders, for their team. And I think that's where it starts to get interesting, because the people that can make the most change and actually affect or reduce their attrition rates or reduce regrettable turnover are the leaders themselves, particularly when the motivators within the teams are things like, poor culture, teamwork, those sort of things. So I think having that data available for leaders to actually understand, they're the ones with the context, they're the ones living and breathing their team and understand what some of those motivators are. And typically when we're localizing that data at HR's level, there's nothing that we can really do, because HR are usually reacting to attrition data versus proactive. I think proactive is where the leaders can start stepping in and taking that approach. And it really comes around that attrition data and understanding it. We've just had a question come through. So I see a lot of startups afraid to deal with mediocre performance or poor behavior. Everyone is part of the family, from Danielle. I do agree with that. It's hard to, startups is a really unique culture, and obviously we were a startup, and it's a very, everyone is really trying hard. Everyone's putting that 150% in. So I think when you do have someone that puts in 90%, it is actually a big difference. And obviously that can then have an effect on someone's culture and so on. But I think you could relate that back to Patrick's point around communication, right? Because it's around engagement and it's around communication there, and how you actually, through the onboarding process and even past the onboarding process, continually engage and solicit feedback from employees to be like, how happy are you in your role? How are you actually performing? What are things that you need to do your role better? Because all of that does, have an effect on the turnover there. But look, I'm just conscious of time. I think we're just coming up to the end of the webinar there. I think we're our three own worst enemies, us three, because we could literally just keep talking about these topics non-stop. But look, thank you so much for everyone that attended and for some of the questions that popped in there. Again, as Tom mentioned, this was recorded. So if you know anyone that would be interested in some of the content that was discussed today, please just let us know. It's going to be sent out to you as a attendee as well, so you'll get a copy of it. Otherwise, add us on LinkedIn, send us some messages, give us some feedback on the session, tell us about some topics that you might want to hear in the future as well. We're always interested to explore all the facets of HR and all things data and so on. So other than that, big, massive thank you to Tom and Patrick for your insights, and for everyone at home, thank you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Cheers, everyone.